I want to note before we introduce our next speaker that we do have a question from Dr. Jensen about the organic standards. And Dr. Jensen, I think we will save that question for the report out that will be led by the Agricultural Marketing Service. So thank you for your question, and we'll ask Dr. Schrader to address that in that session. So our next speaker is Stephanie Showalter-Otts from the University of Mississippi School of Law, where she is the director for the National Sea Grant Law Center. So her talk will be what U.S. aquaculture needs from USDA, aquatic plants. Stephanie, please go ahead.
Great. Thanks. And thanks so much for the invitation to present today. I do want to note from the outset that today I'm not a member of the seaweed industry. As Karen mentioned, I'm based at the University of Mississippi, director of the National Sea Grant Law Center. And today I'm here presenting on behalf of a team that conducted a needs assessment with the seaweed industry last year. So next slide. So we're actually part of a national seaweed hub. This is a resource that for the domestic seaweed and seaweed aquaculture industry that was funded by the NOAA National Sea Grant College Program in 2019. The effort is led by Connecticut Sea Grant, but it is managed and facilitated through partnerships with several Sea Grant programs around the country. And for those that might be interested in the work that the hub is doing, it is open to all stakeholders. So please contact your state Sea Grant program or Anushka Concepcion, who is the point person to get involved. We do have a listserv, and as I'll mention in a minute, there are work groups. And so I just wanted to give a bit of a overview of that work. Next slide. So the Seaweed Hub does have a steering committee, and I wanted to mention this just to point out that there is USDA representation on the steering committee along with FDA and NOAA, and the steering committee provides guidance on the work and structure of the Seaweed Hub, how we're using project funds, and different conversations around the committee. So we have had involvement from a wide range of stakeholders to get to this point. Next slide. So the process for the Seaweed Hub was really set up to bring people together to talk about what's going on within the seaweed aquaculture industry, all the way from pre-harvest issues through market issues. And we're doing it through this process of first the needs assessment, which I'm presenting today. We held a Seaweed Symposium in early March. We got it in right before the COVID pandemic travel restrictions hit. So it was March 2nd and 4th. Through that, after the symposium, we have now formed stakeholder work groups who are being facilitated to come up with work plans and potential products that might help to address some of the identified barriers and challenges. And this is a 3-year project. So the symposium and the needs assessment were really the first pieces, and the meat of the project is the work that these stakeholder work groups are going to do. Next slide. Okay. So for the purposes of the presentation today, we thought that it would be helpful to just present the general results from the needs assessment. So these questions were designed collaboratively with the Seaweed Hub Sea Grant program leads throughout the country. We were focused on identifying challenges and needs across geographies and industry roles. And so as you'll see in some later slides, we sent this survey not just to industry members, people growing or cultivating seaweed, but state regulators, federal regulators, chefs, kind of anybody that might have an interest in seaweed and seaweed products. There were differing lines of questions based on the role in the industry, and there were some parallel questions. So the data that I'm going to show covers responses that were received between January 2019 and February of this year. And so we had about 260 responses during that period. Did want to know that we have had some responses come in. The survey was reopened for a bit after the symposium, but that's not reflected in the data that I'll be presenting today. Next slide. So just to give you a sense of where the responses came from, here is what state do you engage in the seaweed industry? And I should also point out that if you notice that the N numbers will change a bit on the slides, and that's because people had the choice of answering more than one question. And so on some of the slides, we have more answers than the total responses because of the way that the survey was designed. But you can see we got most responses came from Washington State, followed by Maine, and then the New England states with Alaska mixed in there. And so that really gives you a sense of where most of the activity around seaweed cultivation and conversation is happening in the country. Next slide. So, and here just illustrates what I mentioned before about we were designing the survey to reach a whole range of stakeholders within the industry. And so this highlights where most of the answers came from. So most came from prospective growers or permitted growers, but we had a lot of researchers and regulators, processors, fewer culinary professionals, but we did get some answers, and then a mix of harvesters, extension, education type individuals in there. So we feel that we got a large diversity of stakeholder groups within the seaweed industry. Next slide. So this is responses from the survey about what species that they are using currently. So culinary species in use, and then species that are like that individual survey responses indicated that they were either growing or conducting research on, or processing, right? So I think the main takeaways here is if you look at the species that the survey respondents said they were kind of already using or conducting research on, it's primarily sugar kelp. But if you look at the survey responses about what species were being used by culinary professionals, nori was the most, although sugar kelp is not that far behind. And so I think this just illustrates kind of where the current use of seaweed species in the United States is based on our survey responses. Next slide. And here, this is a slightly different question. So this question tried to get at, okay, so maybe if you're not using it, it's still a species of interest for growers. And so again, sugar kelp leads the way, but you can see that dulse, nori, and then gracilaria and sea lettuce and alaria kind of mix in there. So there's a mix of species that is being considered and looked at by growers. Next slide. So after collecting some basic information from the survey respondents, then the needs assessment tried to drill down and focus on what were the top challenges or barriers holding the industry back, or holding your particular business back, or what you saw as your role as the top challenges. And so I'm just going to go through a few slides that highlight the challenges that received the most kind of votes or responses in the survey. There is a more detailed presentation of summary of this needs assessment that is available on the Seaweed Hub website under the Symposium tab. And so if you are interested in kind of more detail about the various responses of these sectors, then I would encourage you to go to our website and download the kind of more detailed presentation. But from the permitted growers who responded to the survey, their top challenges were finding buyers for products. and this could be, there's some nuance here. So we didn't define products in the survey. And so this potentially for some people could have included crops, the crop itself, the seaweed that they were harvesting, or some value added products. So additional research is probably needed to get into more detail about where the actual challenges are. But most permitted growers kind of signaled that finding buyers is a challenge. Access to infrastructure, whether that's kind of shoreside infrastructure like processing or other pieces of infrastructure, could be capital as well. And then economics on the need or challenge of not having kind of the economics on cost of production or market value of their work. For regulators, we broke them into two categories. They could say whether they were a public health regulator, so more concerned with food safety, or if they were permitting on kind of the natural resource or space side of things. And so for public health, challenges were information on food safety and the need for clear regulations. And then for permitting, challenge was potential environmental interactions, spread of non-native species or pathogens, and just identified a need for assistance for growers about the regulations. Next slide. For processors, the challenges they identified were consistent supply and having enough options regarding the source, right? So to make sure that they have enough product coming in that they can, you know, have enough to process and make it worth their time and money. On the nursery side, operational costs were identified as a challenge. Being able to meet or attain the necessary certifications and licenses, and then also having enough access to wild seed stock. Next slide. For culinary professionals, they highlighted that, you know, their challenge was availability of forms. So I think this gets back to the chart that I showed earlier, where what the chefs are looking for with regard to seaweed species might not be what the US domestic industry is producing right now, or not at the scale that maybe is needed to serve these markets. And so again, challenges of attaining seaweed, consumer demand, and consistent supply. So there might be a lot of demand in a certain area or a farm to plate type of activity, but not enough of a consistent supply. So there's some mismatches between the industry and at least the kind of restaurant culinary piece. For researchers, they sought guidance on permitting for seaweed research, post-harvest opportunities. So, you know, what do they do with the seaweed that they're growing or doing research on? And again, concerns about food safety. Next slide. So those were kind of the takeaways from the formal needs assessment survey. Those results were presented at the Seaweed Symposium that was held in March. And we also gathered information and feedback through that symposium, which built on the information that we were gathering from the needs assessment. And so what I'll talk about on the next couple of slides are just what rose to the top during the conversations at the symposium. So one of the challenges was that consumers are unfamiliar with seaweed, and significant competition exists with other products like maybe kale or specialty vegetables. And so the symposium participants talked about an opportunity to have a marketing campaign to brand US seaweed, but also a need to invest in consumer education and validation. Another problem that was talked a lot about was being able to scale the farm and the processing operations to meet new market demand, or even existing marketing demand. So many of these existing seaweed some are very large, but some are small, and it's not easy for them to scale up. So even if they do find a new market for their product, they might not have the resources or the infrastructure to scale up. and quickly the way that they would want to. So some opportunities discussed were to identify points of entry so multiple growers could contribute to a single market. So, and then talk about co-op or collective opportunities for processing, or investing in equipment and facilities that could help increase that capacity and to improve and help facilitate the scaling of those farm operations. Next slide. I mentioned it before, but access to capital, infrastructure, and processing was a challenge that came up a lot. So the need or the opportunity is to increase investment in that part of the supply chain and identify, distribution channels. And challenge also with regard to the supply chain is that there's currently no standards, grading, or accurate labeling. There's like confusion over things like organic, what the process is, but also other just, regular type of labeling for the product. Nutritional information is not always readily available or known. And so as an industry collectively, there's challenges there with trying to be able to market and label the product with the type of consumer information that's needed or wanted. And so opportunities to, kind of get more of that consumer information into the hands of the industry members and processors, and to develop protocols for that could establish grading for the marketplace. And then just a final general challenge of limited season and species availability, which is, always a challenge kind of in the aquaculture and fisheries world, that not all the species are available all the time. And you may have a need or an opportunity to diversify, invest in some processing and storage, and identify markets that could extend the season. Next slide. So with that background, our group thought a little bit about what could the role of the USDA be in addressing these challenges. And some of this is likely already happening, but it may not be well known among seaweed farmers, processors, and the industry. So some of these challenges could be addressed maybe just by raising awareness and clarifying when seaweed qualifies for some of these programs. But research is needed for projects that target the developing of processing and distribution capacity, research projects to improve domestic and international market opportunities for growers, producers, and processors, and a need for production research, whether that's biosecurity, crop disease, genetics and breeding, intertrophic, multi-level, or whatever the acronym I always get wrong for IMTA. Also funding programs, so increasing loans and grants that are available for seaweed farmers and processors to help address these challenges, including seaweed farmers and processors as eligible participants in USDA programs where appropriate and legally permissible. And again, they may already be eligible for many of these programs and might not know it. So it could be more of an educational challenge than a legal one. Next slide. And then just to touch on standards and certification, I think there's a real need to clarify the scope, process, and resources available for USDA organic certification of seaweed crops and products. There is some out there if it's used in livestock feed, but there's a lot of confusion and kind of misunderstanding about how that might work for the wider sector. So I think that some increased outreach and information about that could be very beneficial to the industry. Supporting the development of supply chain standards and accurate labeling could help with the consumer piece of it. And then assistance with marketing development, whether it's a unified marketing campaign for farm seaweed, development of some nutritional profiles that would help the industry in the market, but also providing assistance or identifying a process for facilitating opportunities, relationships with international markets. For instance, there have been some conversations with buyers in other countries that might wish to purchase U.S. seaweed, but no one really knows, how to have those conversations or what the process might be for getting the type of export permits that you might need or authorizations. And so is there someone at USDA that has experience with that might be a point person or could help to facilitate those kind of conversations and opportunities as they arise within the sector? Next slide. So with that, I'll close and just want to say thank you, first of all, to the wider Seaweed Hub team for helping to put this presentation together and for the opportunity to present and share our work.
All right. Thank you, Stephanie, for your presentation and all the work that you and your team have put into identifying some of the challenges and possibilities for seaweed. So thank you for that presentation.